Brinkhaven was once a peaceful town, but beneath its surface lay a web of corruption and danger. When an undercover agent steps in, the rotten system is on the brink of collapse. Follow along as James, an FBI agent, takes on Michael, the mastermind behind the corrupt police network. Long-buried secrets will come to light in a fierce battle between justice and power. If you want to find out who will truly prevail, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next thrilling developments. Brinkhaven was once a town where everyone knew each other, where laughter echoed through family dinners, and tree-lined streets exuded a sense of safety. But those days are long gone. Now, a suffocating atmosphere hangs over the town. Silent glances are exchanged under the dim glow of street lights, and the residents have lost faith in those who were meant to protect them. David, a journalist driven by an unyielding pursuit of truth, feels the pain of the town he once cherished. He remembers his childhood, a time when the police were not a source of fear. But now, the familiar faces behind those uniforms are hiding something, and he refuses to turn a blind eye. Somewhere in the shadows of Brinkhaven, James watches silently. He wasn't born here, but he feels the weight of every injustice, every desperate gaze. He knows he can't undo the past, but he can fight for the future. In the thick darkness of corruption, a sliver of hope still flickers. But will he have enough time to bring it into the light? The streets of Brinkhaven are no longer as peaceful as they once were. Behind every locked door, fearful whispers linger. The people no longer trust the police. Those who were once symbols of safety have now become the very source of their unease. Michael, with the appearance of a hero, still walks the streets, flashing a friendly smile. The greetings, the handshakes with the locals, it's all an elaborate facade. But behind the doors of the police station, the truth is far more sinister. Under-the-table deals take place in the shadows. Envelopes of cash exchange hands in return for silence. Criminals who should be behind bars are set free, and those who dare to speak up are silenced. John, Darren, and Robert are all cogs in this corrupt machine. They were once dedicated officers, but power and money have changed them. Do any of them still remember their first days wearing the badge, when they believed in justice and integrity? Brinkhaven is still waiting for change. Something or someone must break the silence before it's too late. David never thought he would become the enemy of those who once protected this town. He grew up on the streets of Brinkhaven, where the police were once heroes in his eyes. As a child, he looked up to them with admiration, believing that justice was absolute. But now, all he saw were uniforms hiding dark schemes. Every article he wrote brought him closer to the truth, but it also pushed him deeper into danger. The threatening phone calls in the middle of the night, the unsettling signs that he was being watched. It all made him realize he was touching something forbidden. But he couldn't stop. There were moments when David questioned if he was losing too much, his peaceful nights, his own safety, maybe even his life. But then he thought of the fearful faces of Brinkhaven's citizens, the eyes too afraid to meet power head-on. They needed the truth. They needed hope. And he would be the one to bring it to them, no matter the cost. Richard had spent his entire career believing in justice. He joined the legal system with the hope of protecting the vulnerable, of bringing fairness to those who had been trampled on. But now, standing within the walls of the prosecutor's office, he faced a bitter reality. Justice did not always prevail. He had tried, gathering evidence, chasing leads, searching for answers. But every time he got too close to the truth, an invisible hand intervened. His superiors refused to investigate. Every time he suggested reopening a case on the police department, wary glances were exchanged, veiled warnings were sent his way. Brinkhaven was too far gone. He felt powerless, but not hopeless. A part of him still believed that someone else could see what he saw, that there was someone out there willing to break the silence. And then he found David, a journalist who was digging into Brinkhaven's dark past on his own. Their battle was anything but fair. A journalist and a prosecutor against an entire corrupt system. But in the dead of night, even the smallest light could tear through the darkness. Doors could be locked, but the truth always found a way out. That was what James believed when he first took on his mission in Brinkhaven. David's articles, Richard's quietly gathered files, they all painted a picture of a town rotting from the inside, but something was still missing, undeniable proof. James knew he couldn't trust anyone. Every step had to be carefully calculated. In this town, even those behind bars could still be the ones pulling the strings. But despite everything, he still had faith, because no matter how powerful corruption was, the truth could never be hidden forever. There were nights when James wondered why he had taken this mission, why he had chosen to become a ghost, walking through danger unnoticed. But then he thought of the hopeless faces of the townspeople, of the children growing up with fear instead of safety. If no one else would stand up, then who would? James knew the answer, and he couldn't turn his back on it. James stepped into Brinkhaven under a false identity, but his mission was all too real. He was no stranger to towns like this. Places where corruption seeped into every corner, where fear had taken root so deeply that the people no longer dared to speak out. Using the name Rachel Monroe, he became a county records clerk, an outsider, harmless and unassuming. No one suspected him. No one knew that every file he touched, every handshake he exchanged, brought him one step closer to the truth. But James couldn't forget who he was. He could feel the pain of the people here. He wasn't just an agent. He was a man fighting not only for justice, but for those who had lost faith in it. Brinkhaven deserved another chance. David didn't know if he could trust anyone anymore. He had spent months chasing the truth, only to find every door slammed shut in his face. Every lead was erased, every witness silenced. Then James appeared, a stranger with no apparent ties to the town. But there was something about him. His eyes were too sharp, his questions too precise. He wasn't just another curious outsider. And when James slid a cup of coffee across the table at the quiet diner and whispered, "I know what you're looking for, and I can help," David realized that everything was about to change. Hope, once thought lost, began to flicker again. But could he risk his life on a man he barely knew? Brinkhaven was a town full of secrets, and James had to learn how to become part of it. He couldn't rush, couldn't let a single sign of suspicion slip. He had to make people believe he was nothing more than a county records clerk. The first few days passed in careful observation. He listened to conversations in coffee shops, memorized the unfamiliar faces that passed through town. He built connections with friendly smiles and small talk about Brinkhaven's history. But he knew he wasn't just a spectator. Every conversation, every handshake, was another piece of a dangerous puzzle he was assembling. Beneath the town's quiet facade, he could feel the fear, the unease, and that only confirmed one thing: justice still had a chance, as long as he didn't reveal himself too soon. Robert never liked newcomers. It was an unspoken rule he had always followed. In a small town like Brinkhaven, strangers usually brought trouble, and Rachel Monroe, or rather James, was no exception. From the moment they first met at a community event, Robert sensed something was off. This woman was too careful, too composed. She didn't seem like someone who was here just for a simple records job. He watched from a distance, noting every expression, every subtle movement. Every time they crossed paths, he looked for cracks in her facade. But James played his role too well. Still, Robert's instincts had never failed him before. Brinkhaven might not realize the threat looming over it, but he did. What he didn't know was that this time he was the one being watched. James knew he was taking a risk. The warehouse meeting wasn't just a bold move. It could be his last. If he was wrong, if he was caught, everything would end right here. The open lot in front of the warehouse was swallowed in darkness, the dim moonlight casting long shadows over the cold concrete. Any one of the men about to walk in could kill him on the spot. But James had no other choice. He needed evidence, and he was going to get it at any cost. Footsteps echoed. The heavy metal door groaned as it slid open. 3 men stepped inside, John and Darren among them. When their eyes met, James felt a surge of adrenaline rush through his veins. Everything depended on how he played this hand. He forced a relaxed smile, masking the rapid pounding of his heart. "Shall we do business?" James kept his breathing steady, controlling every flicker of his expression. Across from him, John and Darren weren't in a rush, but their eyes held the weight of suspicion. One wrong move, and it was over. His hand rested casually on his thigh, concealing the tiny recording device tucked under his jacket sleeve. Every word spoken, every deal made tonight, would become undeniable proof. Darren studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Who are you?" His voice was low, edged with distrust. James shrugged, flashing an easy grin. "Someone who can make you more money." A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, finally, John nodded. An unspoken agreement passed between them. James felt his pulse hammering at his temple. He had taken a step forward, but could he leave this place alive? James tightened his fingers inside his pocket, feeling every thud of his racing heartbeat. He had what he came for, a deal, irrefutable proof. But now came the hardest part, getting out without raising suspicion. John and Darren were still watching him, their gazes sharp and unreadable. These men were predators, ones who had spent too long in the shadows to be easily fooled. "You know the rules, don't you?" Darren's voice carried a warning beneath the words. James smirked, masking the tension in his chest. "I have no intention of breaking them." A handshake, brief but weighted, sealed the moment. James had just signed his own death warrant if he was exposed, but at the same time, he had loaded the gun. One well-timed shot, and their entire empire would crumble. James stepped out of the warehouse, each footstep heavy as if the weight of all of Brinkhaven was pressing down on his shoulders. He had what he needed, proof of the police force's corruption. But that also meant he was being watched, every second, every move. His car was parked in the distance, its silver paint catching the flickering glow of the streetlights. He needed to get out of here immediately. But in the darkness, a familiar feeling crept into his mind. Suspicion. What if someone had been watching him? What if Darren or John had sensed something was off? Did he have enough time to run, or had his fate been sealed the moment he stepped into this game? As he slid into the driver's seat, his hands still trembling slightly on the steering wheel, one thought flashed through his mind. Was this the last time he would ever drive out of Brinkhaven? When news of the secret investigation leaked, Michael instantly realized that the empire he had built over the years was standing on the brink of collapse. A bitter regret settled in his chest, not for the things he had done, but for the careless mistakes that had let power slip through his fingers. At the same time, James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. An electric tension surged through his veins. He couldn't believe the final move had come this soon. David, with his deep connection to Brinkhaven, felt both hope and fear. Was the evidence James had given him strong enough to dismantle this web of corruption? He couldn't stop thinking about the innocent people who had suffered because of neglect and injustice. Standing at the eye of the coming storm, David realized something unexpected. He and James weren't just collaborators anymore. They were allies, bound together by a shared purpose: to save Brinkhaven's soul. David stared at the USB drive in his hand as if it were growing heavier by the second. He understood its significance. This wasn't just data, it was their lives. If the men in the shadows discovered it, everything would be over before they even had a chance to expose the truth. James kept his voice steady, but his eyes were filled with urgency. "If anything happens to me, you know what to do." David swallowed hard. He didn't want to believe James might not make it back. But that was the reality. This game was too dangerous, and one wrong move could mean they both disappeared forever. In the silence between them, there was an unspoken understanding. The bond of two men walking the razor's edge between life and death. Hope was now in their hands. But was it strong enough to change the fate of Brinkhaven? James stood in the shadows of the old library basement, the dim light from the desk lamp casting flickering reflections on Richard's tense face. The files were open on the screen, the recordings playing loud and clear, a confession that could not be denied. Richard looked up at James, his eyes a mix of shock and apprehension. "We can end this." But his voice trailed off, as if realizing that the truth didn't just bring justice, it also brought danger. James nodded. They had come too far to turn back now. One mistake, one misstep, and they could be silenced forever. Outside, the Brinkhaven night was cold and eerily still, but inside, the fire of hope had been lit. The battle wasn't over yet, but now they had something the enemy could never buy: the truth. And James was ready to do whatever it took to bring it to light. Brinkhaven had never been this quiet. But this silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before the storm. James stood outside the courthouse, his hands clenched tightly inside his coat pockets. Today, justice would be judged. Up on the grand steps, Michael and his men walked with arrogant confidence. They believed they had already won. Inside the courtroom, Richard gripped the case files firmly in his hands. He knew they had all the evidence, but that didn't mean they were safe. David sat in the front row, pen trembling slightly in his fingers. He had waited too long for this day. Everything they had endured, the fear, the threats, the doubt, had led them to this moment. James took a deep breath. Justice had been silent for too long, but today it would roar louder than ever before. Inside the courtroom, the tension was razor sharp, a thread stretched to its breaking point. James stood at the edge, watching the faces around him. This wasn't just a trial, it was the moment that would decide the fate of Brinkhaven. Michael sat confidently in the defendant's chair, his eyes filled with defiance. He had manipulated this system for too long to believe that anyone could bring him down. But this time, he was wrong. Richard presented the evidence. Each recording echoed through the courtroom, each long-hidden document now laid bare for all to see. David held his breath as he watched the shift in the jury's expressions, from uncertainty to sheer horror. And then, the moment they had all been waiting for arrived. The judge's voice rang through the silent room. "Guilty." James closed his eyes for a brief second. They had done it. Brinkhaven had been given a second chance, but the fight wasn't over. Justice had to be protected, and he wouldn't stop now. Brinkhaven awoke to the morning sun, but today the air felt different. No more sirens signaling intimidation, no more wary glances as police cars rolled by. The city had changed, or at least it had been given the chance to. James stood outside the federal building, watching the transport vans carry Michael and his men away. He was no longer the ruler of Brinkhaven. Richard stepped beside him, exhaling a breath of relief. "We won." But they both knew this was only the beginning. Across the street, David typed the final lines of his article, while the people of Brinkhaven walked past uniformed officers with something new in their expressions, hope instead of fear. James walked away in silence. He didn't need recognition. All that mattered was that, this time, justice had truly prevailed. In a small cafe at the heart of Brinkhaven, David quietly typed the final words of the most important article of his life. The story wasn't just about Michael's downfall. It was about courage, about the people who dared to stand up when it seemed like all was lost. Across the street, Richard met with a team of federal prosecutors. They had won, but the work wasn't over. Shadows still lingered, and Brinkhaven still bore wounds that would take time to heal. As the sun set, James left the town without a word. He didn't need anyone to know his name, didn't need anyone to praise him. But as he passed a small park, he saw children playing. No fear, only laughter. For the first time in a long while, Brinkhaven had a future, and that was all he needed to know. Camera flashes lit up the square as dozens of reporters crowded the podium. They had waited for this moment, the moment justice was brought into the light. James stood before the microphone, his gaze steady. Today wasn't about him. It was about the truth they had fought to protect. Brinkhaven has proven that no one is above the law. His voice carried across the square, each word heavy with the weight of all that had happened. In the front row, David scribbled down every word while Richard nodded in quiet satisfaction. Not everyone got to witness a true victory, but today they had made it happen. From the crowd, a single voice called out, "Thank you," and then applause erupted across the square. James looked over the sea of faces, a faint smile crossing his lips. Justice had won. And this time, it would not be lost again. Brinkhaven had changed, no longer a town shrouded in darkness, where people lived in fear and silence. Now, they walked the streets with newfound faith, a hope that justice still existed. David sat on the steps of the newsroom, watching as reports of the case spread nationwide. He had fulfilled his mission, bringing the truth to light. But deep down, he knew this story wasn't just about an article. It was about the people who dared to fight. Richard continued his work, overseeing the reform of the police department. He understood that one battle had ended, but the fight to uphold justice was far from over. From somewhere far away, James watched in silence. He didn't need recognition or fame. It was enough to know that Brinkhaven had been given a second chance, and this time they wouldn't let it slip away. Brinkhaven was no longer a town consumed by fear. Change didn't happen overnight, but their tomorrows were already different. No more silence, no more shadows. David walked down Main Street watching as shop windows glowed and people talked freely, no longer glancing over their shoulders. They had reclaimed their town. Richard stood outside the prosecutor's office, fresh case files in hand. He knew justice wasn't a destination. It was a relentless journey. From a distance, James took one last look at Brinkhaven. His job here was done. A part of him wanted to stay, but he knew justice wasn't needed in just one place. It needed people like him everywhere. He turned and walked away, leaving the past behind. And somewhere out there, another town was waiting for someone like him to arrive. The story of Brinkhaven wasn't just about fighting corruption. It was proof of the power of truth and courage. It reminded us that justice isn't always easy to achieve. Sometimes it requires people willing to risk everything to fight for it. David, Richard, and James refused to turn away from injustice, knowing full well that the road ahead was dangerous. The lesson here is clear. Silence only makes the darkness stronger, but one voice willing to stand up can change everything. When a community chooses to face the truth, when honest people refuse to be afraid, even the most powerful cannot hide forever. Justice isn't some distant ideal. It is something that must be defended every single day. And sometimes, it all starts with one person brave enough to speak the truth. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.